Hello, you're right. This is lesson 5, chapter 5 of Animal Farm. So once again, pop down your title and your date. I have planned for this to take place on Wednesday, the 1st of April. But as ever, if you are doing this on a different date, just write the correct date. It doesn't matter. So pause the video for a moment while you get that done. And then the next thing you obviously need to do is format your page for your notes. Pause the video while you do that. And then the next thing I'd like you to do this time, slightly different to previously, is look at the vocab. So this is your vocab list for this chapter. So we're looking at expulsion, maxim, oppose, controversy, primitive, and conjured. So the first thing I would like you to do is focus on these 3 words because these have been covered previously. Expulsion, maxim, and oppose. Write them down and then try your best from memory to write the definition, and then go back through your notes and double check with your green pen how accurate was your memory of the definition of those words. So pause the video for a moment whilst you do that task. And the next, I'm going to provide the vocab for the chapter ahead of time. I actually think that might be helpful rather than pausing in the middle of your notes. So the 3 words from this chapter that I would like you to make note of are controversy, which is a disagreement. Primitive, which you may remembered from The Tempest. Primitive essentially means unevolved. So Caliban, it could be said, was presented as being primitive, as not being fully evolved. That was sort of the Jacobean perspective on that character. He was somehow not as evolved as the Western colonialists. So primitive, unevolved, and conjured. So conjured, we often hear that word in context to magic, a magician conjuring something out of his hat. And if you conjure something, you essentially make it appear as if from nowhere. So like when a magician pulls a rabbit out of his hat, that rabbit has been conjured. But you can also use that term metaphorically. So like an idea might be conjured up within your mind. It's like this idea has just come from nowhere. You can conjure up a plan, okay? So they are the 3 words that I would like you to make note of today. Pause the video if you need to get them written down, and then we will start reading. So, chapter 5. As winter drew on, Molly became more and more troublesome. She was late for work every morning and excused herself by saying that she had overslept, and she complained of mysterious pains, although her appetite was excellent. On every kind of pretext, she would run away from work and go to the drinking pool, where she would stand foolishly gazing at her own reflection in the water. Turn the phone. I need to step back. Sorry. That will mess up the video. So, her own reflection in the water. But there were also rumours of something more serious. One day, as Molly strolled blithely into the yard, flirting her long tail and chewing at a stalk of hay, Clover took her aside. So blithely, it's casual, it's carefree, so Molly's just strolling through the yard and Clover takes her to one side for a chat. "Molly," she said, "I have something very serious to say to you. This morning I saw you looking over the hedge that divides Animal Farm from Foxwood. One of Mr. Pilkington's men was standing on the other side of the hedge, and I was a long way away, but I'm almost certain I saw this. He was talking to you, and you were allowing him to stroke your nose." "What does that mean, Molly?" "I didn't. I wasn't. It isn't true," cried Molly, beginning to prance about and paw the ground. "Molly, look me in the face. Do you give me your word of honour that that man was not stroking your nose?" "It isn't true," repeated Molly, but she could not look Clover in the face. And the next moment she took to her heels and galloped into the field. A thought struck Clover. Without saying anything to the others, she went to Molly's stall and turned over the straw with her hoof. Hidden under the straw was a little pile of lump sugar and several bunches of ribbon of different colours. 3 days later, Molly disappeared. For some weeks, nothing was known of her whereabouts. Then the pigeons reported that they had seen her on the other side of Willingdon. She was between the shafts of a small dog cart painted red and black, which was standing outside a public house. A fat, red-faced man in check breeches and gaiters, who looked like a publican, was stroking her nose and feeding her with sugar. Her coat was newly clipped, and she wore a scarlet ribbon round her forelock. She appeared to be enjoying herself, so the pigeon said. None of the animals ever mentioned Molly again. Okay, so that's your first note on this chapter to jot down. So Molly deserts the farm and goes over to the humans. So pause the video for a moment while you get that point down. In January, there came bitterly hard weather. The earth was like iron and nothing could be done in the fields. Many meetings were held in the big barn, and the pigs occupied themselves with planning out the work of the coming season. It had come to be accepted that the pigs, who were manifestly cleverer than the other animals, should decide all questions of farm policy, though their decisions had to be ratified by a majority vote. So the pigs have emerged as the leaders firmly now. There's no questioning it. Ratified means agreed or allowed, but which does imply a democracy or a democratic approach in which the people do have to support the decisions of those in leadership. But as we read on, just ask yourself if that's actually the case, if that's truly what's happening. This arrangement would have worked well enough if it had not been for the disputes between Snowball and Napoleon. These two disagreed at every point where disagreement was possible. If one of them suggested sowing a bigger acreage of barley, the other was certain to demand a bigger acreage of oats. And if one of them said that such and such a field was just right for cabbages, the other would declare that it was useless for anything except roots. Each had its own following, and there were violent debates. At the meetings, Snowball often won over the majority by his brilliant speeches, but Napoleon was better at canvassing support for himself in between times. So if you canvass, you work to gain followers, and you see that during times of general election, when you get people knocking at your doors, giving you their leaflets, posting things through your letterbox. They are canvassing. They are canvassing for your support. They are looking for you to follow them, to vote for them. He was especially successful with the sheep. Of late, the sheep had taken to bleating 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, both in and out of season, and they often interrupted the meeting with this. Okay, one thing to think about is, earlier in the book, harsh as it sounds, the sheep were described as pretty much the stupidest animals. And it is the sheep that Napoleon is working really hard to manipulate, because they're easy to manipulate. He is the people that he is targeting with his canvassing, largely people, the group. That is the group that he's largely targeting with his canvassing. And you want to think a little bit about applying that to modern politics. What groups of people do controversial leaders tend to target? There is definitely a message there about how a lack of education can be really dangerous, because it makes you so open to manipulation by some quite sinister forces, which Napoleon is certainly emerging as. It was noticed that they were especially liable to break into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad at crucial moments in Snowball's speeches. Snowball had made a close study of some back numbers of the Farmer and Stock Breeder, which he had found in the farmhouse, and was full of plans and innovations and improvements. So what we're seeing in Snowball is that Snowball's approach to leadership is very different. Snowball is intelligent and reads and researches and actually does seek democratic approval. Very, very different to the very bullish way that Napoleon is attempting to rule, based more on manipulation. He talked learnedly about field drains, silage and basic slag, and had worked out a complicated scheme for all the animals to drop their dung directly in the fields at a different spot every day to save the labour of cartage. Napoleon produced no schemes of his own, but said quietly that snowballs would come to nothing, and seemed to be biding his time. Of all their controversies, none was bitterer than the one that took place over the windmill. In the long pasture, not far from the farm buildings, there was a small knoll. Remember, a knoll's like a small hill, grassy hill, which was the highest point on the farm. After surveying the ground, Snowball declared that this was just the place for a windmill, which could be made to operate a dynamo and supply the farm with electrical power. This would light the stalls and warm them in winter, and also run a circular saw, a chaff cutter, a mangle slicer and an electric milking machine. The animals had never heard of anything of this kind before, for the farm was an old-fashioned one and only had the most primitive machinery, and they listened in astonishment while Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines which could do their work for them. Okay, so what we're seeing here, Snowball has really done his research and has decided that the logical thing to invest their labour into is a windmill. So hopefully you've all seen them around and about. Here are a few different sort of designs. What you see here is like ones like these. These are like your more traditional windmills that likely would have been used to sort of mill flour and things, but they have evolved over time. So you see these wind generators quite often, quite commonly around. And so what a windmill can do is, with its blades, the wind propels the blades and it can be used to generate electricity. And what this decision is a bit symbolic of is the ways that some leaders, in order to move the country forward, will invest in technology. And that is what Snowball is doing. Snowball is investing in technology in order to make the lives of the animals easier and more comfortable. He's stated the benefits that they'll have light, they'll be able to have heat in the winter, they'll be able to produce machinery that could actually do some of the hard labour for them. Okay, so that's your next point here, is that Snowball has begins working on plans to produce a windmill which will be able to generate electricity and make their jobs easier and more efficient. However, predictably, Napoleon is going to oppose these plans quite severely. So we got to the end of the page, didn't we? Fantastic machines which could do their work for them, while they grazed at their ease in the fields or improved their minds with reading and conversation. Within a few weeks, Snowball's plans for the windmill were fully worked out. The mechanical details came mostly from 3 books which belonged to Mr. Jones. 1,000 useful things to do about the house, Every Man His Own Bricklayer, and Electricity for Beginners. Snowball used as his study a shed which had once been used for incubators and had a smooth wooden floor, suitable for drawing on. He was closeted in there for hours at a time, with his books held open by a stone and with a piece of chalk gripped between the knuckles of his trotter. He would move rapidly to and fro, drawing in line after line and uttering little whimpers of excitement. Gradually, the plans grew into a complicated mass of cranks and cogwheels, covering more than half the floor, which the other animals found completely unintelligible but very impressive. All of them came to look at Snowball's drawings at least once a day. Even the hens and ducks came, and were in pains not to tread on the chalk marks. Only Napoleon held aloof. He had declared himself against the windmill from the start. One day, however, he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily around the shed, looked closely at every detail of the plans, and snuffed at them once or twice, then stood for a little while contemplating them out of the corner of his eye. Then suddenly he lifted his leg, urinated over the plans, and walked out without uttering a word. The whole farm was deeply divided on the subject of the windmill. Snowball did not deny that to build it would be a difficult business. Stone would have to be quarried and built into walls, and the sails would have to be made after that. And then the sails that would need to be made after that, there would need to be dynamos and cables. How these were to be procured, Snowball did not say. So procure means get hold of. So they don't know where they're going to get all of the raw materials that they actually need for the windmill. But he maintained that it could be done in a year. And thereafter, he declared, so much labour would be saved that the animals would only need to work 3 days a week. Napoleon, on the other hand, argued that the great need of the moment was to increase food production, and that if they wasted time on the windmill, they would all starve to death. The animals forced themselves into 2 factions under the slogans Vote for Snowball and the 3-day week and Vote for Napoleon and the full manger. Benjamin was the only animal who did not side with either faction. He refused to believe either that food would become more plentiful or that the windmill would save work. Windmill or no windmill, he said, life would go on as it had always gone on. That is, badly. Apart from the disputes over the windmill, there was the question of defence on the farm. It was fully realised that though the human beings had been defeated in the Battle of the Cowshed, they might make another and more determined attempt to recapture the farm and reinstate Mr. Jones. They had all the more reason for doing so, because the news of their defeat had spread across the countryside and made the animals on the neighbouring farms more restive than ever. Restive means that you have an inability to settle or relax. So basically, the animals on the farm are restless. They have got revolution on their minds. As usual, Snowball and Napoleon were in disagreement. According to Napoleon, what the animals must do was produce firearms and train themselves in the use of them. According to Snowball, they must send out more and more pigeons and stir up rebellion among the other animals on the farms. The one argued that if they could not defend themselves, they were bound to be conquered, and the other argued that if rebellions happened everywhere, they would have no need to defend themselves. Right, so here we've got another disagreement. Your next notes for this chapter. So you've got Napoleon states that his priorities are to increase food production and build a military. Snowball and Napoleon now divide the opinion on the farm, and there is a battle for leadership. So they both have 2 very opposing views of how best to run the farm. Okay, so pause the video here and pop down that next bullet point. The animals listened first to Napoleon and then to Snowball, and could not make up their minds which was right. Indeed, they always found themselves in agreement with which one was speaking at that moment. At last the day came when Snowball's plans were completed. At the meeting on the following Sunday, the question of whether or not to begin work on the windmill was to be put to the vote. When the animals had assembled in the big barn, Snowball stood up and, though occasionally interrupted by the bleating from the sheep, set forth his reasons for advocating the building of the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense and that he advised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. He had spoken for barely 30 seconds and seemed almost indifferent as to the effect he produced. At this, Snowball sprang to his feet and, shouting down the sheep, who had begun bleating again, broke into a passionate appeal in favour of the windmill. Until now, the animals had been about equally divided in their sympathies, but in a moment, Snowball's eloquence had carried them away. In glowing sentences, he painted a picture of Animal Farm as it might be when sordid labour was lifted from the animals' backs. His imagination had now run far beyond chaff cutters and turnip slicers. Electricity, he said, could operate threshing machines, ploughs, harrows, rollers and reapers and binders, besides supplying every stall with its own electric light, hot and cold water and an electric heater. By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt as to which way the vote would go. But, just at this moment, Napoleon stood up and, casting a peculiar, sidelong look at Snowball, uttered a high-pitched whimper of a kind no one had ever heard before. Okay, so what Snowball has done is Snowball has rallied support through the use of a shared vision. Snowball has a vision for the future that actually would benefit everybody. It's researched, it's going to be hard work, but as a consequence, they will all benefit, or all have the potential to benefit. The only thing that Snowball has done to persuade is use his words and logic and a passionate plea. And now we're going to see how Napoleon reacts. At this, there was a terrible baying outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came out, bounding into the barn. They dashed straight for Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment, he was out of the door, and they were after him. Too amazed and frightened to speak, all the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture that led to the road. He was running as only a pig can run, but the dogs were close on his heels. Suddenly he slipped, and it seemed certain that they had him. Then he was up again, running faster than ever. Then the dogs were gaining on him. One of them all but closed his jaws on Snowball's tail, but Snowball whisked it free, just in time. Then he put on an extra spurt and, with a few inches to spare, slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more. So, where have these dogs come from, do you think? Have a think back to what Napoleon did, I think, in chapter 3, when the puppies were born. Okay, remember they were taken for re-education or education. And now what we can see is that Napoleon's actually ruling through force. Snowball used a common vision to get the support of people, but Napoleon is now going to use fear and violence. Silent and terrified, the animals crept back into the barn. In a moment, the dogs came bounding back. At first, no one had been able to imagine where these creatures came from, but the problem was soon solved. They were the puppies whom Napoleon had taken away from their mothers and reared privately. Though not yet fully grown, they were huge dogs and as fierce-looking as wolves. They kept close to Napoleon. It was noticed that they wagged their tails to him in the same way that other dogs had used to with Mr. Jones. Napoleon, with the dogs following him, now mounted onto the raised portion of the floor where Major had previously stood to deliver his speech. He announced that from now on, the Sunday morning meetings would come to an end. They were unnecessary, he said, and wasted time. Okay, so next bullet point. So during a debate about the future of the windmill, Napoleon releases a pack of vicious dogs to chase away Snowball. He has trained the puppies to defend him. Okay, so pause the video and pop that next bullet point down. Napoleon, with the dogs following him, now mounted onto the raised portion of the floor where Major previously stood to deliver his speech. Okay, there's something in that as well. Think about a leader. Where does the leader stand? Okay, this platform places Napoleon physically above the people, but actually he's also now above them in terms that he is very much the leader. And remember, that goes against the commandment, that ideology of animalism that all animals are equal. This is not equality. They've just replaced one leader in Mr. Jones with another in Napoleon. He announced that from now on, the Sunday morning meetings would come to an end. They were unnecessary, he said, and wasted time. In future, all questions relating to the working of the farm would be settled by a special committee of pigs presided over by himself. So what he has done away with there is democracy. There is now not democracy. The pigs are making all the decisions. These would meet in private and afterwards communicate their decisions to others. The animals would still assemble on Sunday mornings to salute the flag, sing Beasts of England, and receive their orders for the week. But there would be no more debates. Have a little think about what country that sounds a bit like. Okay, what kind of leadership is imposed in that country? So, in spite of the shock that Snowball's expulsion had given them, the animals were dismayed by this announcement. Several of them would have protested it, could they have found the right arguments. Even Boxer was vaguely troubled. He set his ears back, shook his forelock several times, and tried hard to marshal his thoughts. But in the end he could not think of anything to say. Some of the pigs themselves, however, were more articulate. Four young porkers in the front row uttered shrill squeals of disapproval, and all 4 of them sprang to their feet and began speaking at once. But suddenly the dogs sitting round Napoleon let out a deep, menacing growl, and the pigs fell silent and sat down again. Then the sheep broke out into tremendous bleating of 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, which went on for nearly a quarter of an hour and put an end to any chance of discussion. So there's your evidence of of Napoleon ruling through fear. Nobody can speak out against the decisions of Napoleon because he's got this army of dogs enforcing law and order for him. And another thing to think about with those dogs is Napoleon really has just emerged as a bit of a tyrant, as a tyrant essentially. But Napoleon actually took those puppies right at the start. So it's not as if this tyranny has just evolved with the increasing power that the pigs found themselves with. It seems like it was quite calculated. Let's say that was one of the very first things that happened once the farm was in the animals' control, was that those puppies were seized. And that was when the pigs seemed to be working as a team. So it seems like Napoleon has had these intentions from the outset. Afterwards, Squealer was sent round the farm to explain the new arrangements to the other. Okay, remember that Squealer is the spin doctor. It is his job to make everybody believe that Napoleon is doing the right thing. "Comrades," he said, "I trust that every animal here appreciates the sacrifice that Comrade Napoleon has made in taking this extra labour upon himself. Do not imagine, comrades, that leadership is a pleasure. On the contrary, it is a deep and heavy responsibility. No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions for yourself. But sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades, and then where should we be? Suppose you had decided to follow Snowball, with his moonshine of windmills. Snowball, who, as we now know, was no better than a criminal. He fought bravely at the Battle of the Cowshed, said somebody. Bravery is not enough, said Squealer. Loyalty and obedience are more important. And as to the Battle of the Cowshed, I believe the time will come that we shall find that Snowball's part in it was much exaggerated. Discipline, comrades. Iron discipline. That is the watchword for today. One false step and our enemies would be upon us. Surely, comrades, you do not want Jones back. Okay, so look at how language is manipulated here. They're trying to paint Snowball as the enemy. They are using fear to keep people in line. Once again, this argument was unanswerable. Certainly, the animals did not want Jones back. If the holding of debates on Sunday mornings was liable to bring him back, then the debates must stop. Boxer, who had now had time to think things over, voiced a general feeling by saying, "If Comrade Napoleon says it, it must be right." And from then on he adopted the maxim, Napoleon is always right, in addition to his private motto of, "I will work harder." Okay, look at the ridiculousness of this. Obviously, having a meeting and a democratic approach every Sunday will not bring Jones back. But the rhetoric that has been instilled by this spin doctor Squealer has convinced the animals that that will be the case. By this time, the weather had broken and the spring ploughing had begun. The shed where Snowball had drawn his plans of the windmill had been shut up, and it was assumed that the plans had been rubbed off the floor. Every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, the animals assembled at the big barn to receive their orders for the week. The skull of old Major, now clean of flesh, had been disinterred from the orchard and set up on a stump at the foot of the flagstaff beside the gun. So disinterred is to dig up. They've dug up his skull. After the hoisting of the flag, the animals were required to file past the skull in a reverent manner before entering the barn. So they have to walk past the skull reverently, that is to show deep respect in a solemn way. Nowadays, they did not sit all together as they had done in the past. Napoleon, with Squealer and another pig named Minimus, who had a remarkable gift for composing songs and poems, sat on the front on the raised platform, with the 9 young dogs forming a semicircle round them, and the other pigs sitting behind. The rest of the animals sat facing them in the main body of the barn. Napoleon read out the orders for the week in a gruff, soldiery style. And after a single singing of Beasts of England, all the animals dispersed. On the third Sunday after Snowball's expulsion, the animals were somewhat surprised to hear Napoleon announce that the windmill was to be built after all. He did not give any reasons for having changed his mind, but merely warned the animals that this extra task would mean very hard work. It might even be necessary to reduce their rations. The plans, however, had been all prepared, down to the last detail. A special committee of pigs had been at work upon them for the past 3 weeks. The building of the windmill, with various other improvements, was expected to take 2 years. That evening, Squealer explained privately to the other animals that Napoleon had never in reality been opposed to the windmill. On the contrary, it was he who had advocated it in the beginning, and the plan which Snowball had drawn up on the floor of the incubator shed had actually been stolen from among Napoleon's papers. Again, look how Squealer is controlling the beliefs of the people through his stories. The windmill was, in fact, Napoleon's own creation. Why then, asked somebody, had he spoken so strongly against it? Here Squealer looked very sly. That, he said, was Comrade Napoleon's cunning. He had seemed to oppose the windmill, simply as a manoeuvre to get rid of Snowball, who was a dangerous character and a bad influence. Now that Snowball was out of the way, the plan could go forward without his interference. This, said Squealer, was something called tactics. He repeated it a number of times. Tactics, comrades, tactics, skipping round and whisking his tail with a merry laugh. The animals were not certain what the word meant, but Squealer spoke so persuasively, and the 3 dogs who happened to be with him growled so threateningly, that they accepted his explanation without further questions. I think that's a really interesting point there too. None of them knew what the word tactics meant, and that's actually what politicians do, and lawyers do actually too. They intentionally use very high-level language to alienate a large section of the population so that you don't actually know what they're on about. Lawyers do it so that you have to pay them to defend you in court, or it's part of the reason. It's not the entire reason, that's not true. But it's part of the reason that such high-level language is used in those scenarios that regular people just can't decipher it. They need to then pay somebody to help them with that documentation. And politicians do the same. A lot of what politicians say we find very hard to decipher because they've intentionally used ambiguous, unclear language to confuse us, and it helps them pass bills and go ahead with things that they want without too much opposition from the people. Okay, so final notes then. Sunday meetings are now cancelled. The animals take orders from the pigs. Napoleon states that work on the windmill will start, and Squealer convinces everyone that it had originally been Napoleon's idea. Okay, so stop the video at this point, get that final note down. Make sure you do your quiz, that is linked on ePraise. I'll put a couple of extra little tasks if you want something else to do today, and otherwise next video is lesson 6.